All right, Chodesh Tov to everybody. Before we begin, I'd first like to thank the Rav for giving me the opportunity to give this shiur. It's very meaningful for me. So the title of the shiur is the Kashrut of Gelatin. We're going to have a semi-comprehensive discussion of exactly what gelatin is, some of the issues regarding it, and halachic and other problems that might come along regarding whether it can be used amongst ingredients and how it can be going to be used. So before we get into the introduction, we have to understand the introduction of Kashrut itself. So there's something that's known as tam ki kar d'oraita, which basically means that we have to understand that there's an issur to have non-kosher food being consumed, whether it's going to be solid food or beverages. Torah states a number of things that a person is not allowed to consume, pretty much in most circumstances. However, the question becomes, how about the flavor of the non-kosher food itself? Meaning that if you have not the substance being consumed, but part of the flavor is going to be transferred from the non-kosher food to another kosher food, as it were, at the same time during some transfer of flavor, whether that may be through cooking or the dissolving of one into the other. The question is that forbidden as well? And the Gemara tells in the Chulin that tam ki kar basically means that the flavor that is given from a non-kosher food into some other substance is considered as if the flavor and the substance has been consumed inside of it as well. So it's not only a forbidden food that's forbidden, but even the substance and its flavor that is taken inside is forbidden as well. And the question is this an issur d'oraita or is it an issur d'Rabbanan? How do we go about this? Now, it has to be understood that this is, of course, a machlok between Rishonim. Now, most Rishonim hold that the flavor has a status of an issur d'oraita. And there's many psukim that they bring about this to prove this point. Some say that it's learned from the fact that, if you find in the story of the Klei Midian, when the Jews went against the Midianim, we find that many of the pots were taken as part of the spoils. And the Quran tells us that that day they want to be able to use to cook their meals immediately. However, the problem was that as long as you were within a 24-hour time frame, using a pot that has within it non-kosher flavor, it's going to be producing some of the flavor to come back out into the kosher food that you're going to be using. And if that's the case, therefore it's as if you're eating non-kosher food, essentially. So from here, some want to bring a proof that it must be an issur d'oraita because there is a biblical source to this. That's the opinion of most Rishonim. However, Rashi is of the opinion that actually tam ki kar is not issur d'oraita, it's only issur d'Rabbanan, and the only time it is an issur d'oraita is if you're talking about kodashim, meaning anything associated with korbanot. That if you were to have a korban that would be cooked with chulin, with basically non-sacred foods, that chulin food would become forbidden on a d'oraita level because it received within it some korban flavor inside of it. But when it comes to other aspects, it's only issur d'Rabbanan. Now, being that it's the majority holds an issur d'oraita, we do hold, like Lama said, that it is an issur d'oraita as well. And that has how this is passed by the Rambam, Shulchan Aruch, and other authorities as well. Continue with this trend. We have to ask a question: does forbidden flavor make the kosher food asur l'achila indefinitely? Meaning that even if you were to have the smallest amount of non-kosher flavor entering inside of a kosher food, does that make it completely asur? There nothing could be done, or is there a certain limit to which this exists? So we have a Mishnah in Masech Chulin on the 7th parak, the 4th Mishnah. It says the following: it establishes that a forbidden flavor can only forbid an otherwise kosher food only if two conditions are found. Number one, it has to be discernible, meaning that it has to be recognizable, that you could actually be tasting the non-kosher food within the kosher food. And the second one is that it has to provide a beneficial flavor. Or, as we say in Hebrew, noten tam l'shabach. That it has to give, number one, noten tam. It has to give a flavor that could be recognizable. And number two, it has to be l'shabach, meaning that it has to be something that is beneficial. Now, if it's not beneficial, meaning that if it's detrimental to the food, it's going to spoil it, or according to some, that if there's no flavor, there's no benefit whatsoever, that's actually considered to be permitted midoraita and also midorabbanan. However, if, again, two conditions are found, that it has to be noten tam, that it has to be discernible, and it has to be beneficial, both of them are found, it's going to be asur d'oraita, according to all those opinions. So the Gemara in Daf Tzadichet Amud Aleph and Amud Bet records a famous machlok hamorim regarding what is the proportion of kosher to non-kosher food that is necessary that would render the forbidden flavor no longer recognizable. How much kosher food essentially do you actually need to be able to displace the non-kosher food in order for the flavor to no longer be recognizable? Because it's understood, if you were to have a drop of non-kosher food going into a whole, bucket of kosher food, since the proportion is so negligible, it's going to be no longer recognizable. And the question is, how much more is actually necessary in order for it to no longer be recognized as a separate flavor? So there are two opinions that are brought down. The first opinion is from Rabbi Chia bar Abba, who requires a ratio of 60 to 1. Basically meaning that if you have 60 times the amount of kosher food towards the non-kosher food, this is going to be batal b'shishim. Now, before we continue with this, let me just explain something over here. When we're talking about ratios of 60 to 1, this applies in most circumstances, but not in all circumstances. For instance, when it comes to the laws of Truma, you need a ratio of 100 to 1, according to all opinions. When it comes to, let's say, Orla, which is the fruits of the first few years, you need a ratio of 200 to 1. So it requires a lot more. And the reason that tends to be the case is because when you're dealing with larger Isurim, the necessity to displace it is much greater because of the severity of it. But when it comes to chulin, and it's only the forbidden flavors that's involved, and most likely, in most circumstances, it's only an isur lav, and it's not like an isur karet, therefore, it's as long as the flavor itself is being displaced, it's 60 to 1 in that case. I'm sorry?
Percentage.
Right, so it's going to be the percentage. So 60 to 1 percentage is about 0.5%. Around something of the sort. Actually, it's 1.5%. 1.5%. So that's the first opinion, according to Rabbi Chia. The second opinion is Rav Asi, who requires a ratio of 100 to 1. So it's essentially the same thing as you find with Truma. There has to be 100 of non-Truma food to 1 Truma food. He assumes the same thing is true regarding Chulin, in which you have to have 100 parts of kosher food to 1 non-kosher food, and only under that ratio is it no longer going to be any longer noticeable, and the total mixture will be permitted. So what is the source of the machloket? What are they arguing on? And the Gemara tells us that both opinions are based on a difference of understanding regarding what's known as the zroa b'shela, meaning the cooked, the foreleg, right? Zroa is referring to the foreleg of a ram. So what is the zroa b'shela? So if you look at the Torah tells us that we have a concept of a nazir. So the nazir takes upon himself a nazirut for a period of X amount of days, 30 days or so, or longer. And at the end of that period, once he's no longer considered Nazir, he has to bring a korban as a finishing process to this. And the korbanot, there's several that he has to bring. He has to bring a korban chatat, he has to also bring a korban shlamim. And the difference between the two of them is that korban shlamim is something that Nazir himself consumes. The korban chatat, it doesn't go to him, but rather goes completely to the kohen. So here's what happens. The Torah tells us that he has to bring a korban el shlamim. He has to bring a korban shlamim that's made out of, it comes from a ram. And the way it's going to be divided is that the Nazir gets the majority of the animal, whereas the Kohen takes only the right foreleg. Okay? So again, the Nazir takes the majority of the animal, but the Kohen, who is going to be doing the practice of the korbanot, he's going to be taking only a part of the foreleg, and the rest goes to the Nazir. So here's what the Gemara understands. The Zroa is forbidden to non-Kohanim, being that it's only allowed for the Kohen to be taken. But nonetheless, even though the Zroa is forbidden to the Nazir, since it's going to another person, nonetheless it's cooked at the same time with the rest of the animal. So essentially what you have in this mixture is you have an entirety of an animal being cooked with something that belongs only to the Kohen. So from the perspective of the former Nazir, you're basically having kosher food with something that's not kosher to him because he's not allowed to have it. Nonetheless, the Torah says that it's allowed to be cooked together. So from here you have somewhat of an issue. I mean, how is that the case? Isn't there a transfer of flavor that happens during the cooking process, assuming that it's being cooked at the same time, wholly? So the Gemara understands from here that it must be that at a certain point there must be a transfer of flavor that's no longer considered significant enough. Now the question is, what is that transfer of flavor? And this is where you get into the machloket. So we have to first understand the logic that requires only 60 times from Rabbi Chia bar Abba. So here's how he understands it. The Torah requires that both the meat and the bones of the whole animal are part of the heter count, meaning it's part of the kosher count, as it were. that needs to nullify the bones and the meat of the zroa, which would be considered the non-kosher, as it were, from the former nazir. So if you take the totality of all the bones and all the meat from the ram, going against just the meat and the bones of the foreleg, so that would produce 60 times the amount. However, the way they figured it out, they understood that's going to be 60 times the amount, with the range from one to the other. And basically it says that since the foreleg bones are fairly large, one would only achieve 60 times more kosher to forbidden flavor in that case, and from here we understand that it has to be expanded to other cases of kashrut as well. Meaning it's not only in the world of kodashim that this would apply, but since we have a figure of 60 to 1 regarding the nazir, so too it should be applied to all other kosher elements as well. Now the opinion of Rav Asi, who holds that it has to be 100 times more, he argues about what is considered part of the kosher to the non-kosher count. He thinks this works a little differently. He says as follows: the Torah requires not both the meat and the bones, but requires only the meat of the animal against the meat of the zroa. So the bones are not even part of the question whatsoever. And since there's considerably more meat in comparison, even though the bones are out of the picture, therefore he would require 100 times more kosher to forbidden flavor. Basically meaning that in the case of the ram, you have 100 times more meat from the totality of the animal in respect to just the right foreleg. So too, in all other cases of kashrut, you would have to require 100 times more. Now, there's an interesting Tosfot that goes to this discussion, and he recognizes something very interesting. He says that if you look at the actual halakha, when it comes to determine the ratio of 60 to 1 or 100 to 1, he says this is only true when you have two flavors that are different from one another. Basically meaning this whole idea of requiring 60 to 1 is only viable if you could possibly taste the difference. I mean, there's got to be a difference in taste. However, if they have the exact same taste, there's really no distinction between the two of them, the idea of 60 to 1 and 100 to 1 is actually not the reality. Halakha only requires a majority. So basically meaning 2 to 1. So Tosfot understands from here, he has the following question. That if the whole animal is being cooked, presumably you have the same taste from the whole animal to just the zroa. So how is it possible that we're learning the laws of 60 to 1 or 100 to 1 from here if they have the exact same taste, where the 60 to 1 or 100 to 1 reality only applies to things of different tastes? It seems to not be fitting. So from here, Tosfot says that in reality, this whole machok b'Rabbi Chia and Rav Asi regarding the learning of 60 to 1 or 100 to 1 from Zroa b'Shelah, that's actually not where they learn it from. It's a drasha that they make. It's a nice drasha he makes, but he says the reality is it was something that was already received, perhaps a halakha Moshe Sinai, and he says this is something they received from the Rabbanim from earlier generations, but the Rabbanim, they found a hint to it from the Zroa b'Shelah. But he doesn't think that this is actually the limud itself, because it wouldn't make sense. Because from the Torah's perspective, as long as you have a simple majority of the kosher meat to the non-kosher, but since it's the same flavor that's being given, therefore you cannot learn one from the other. So he clarifies that approach. Continuing with this machoket, so we have to understand the Ran's analysis of the machoket. So the Ran says as follows. According to the opinion, that requires 60 times, which means that the bones are included in the count. So the heter bones go to the heter side, the aser bones goes to the aser side. He says the reason that the forbidden bones give off flavor is due to its inherent moisture. So again, we have the bones that are apart from the Zroa b'Shelah. They are forbidden. So therefore we can consider them to some extent as being non-kosher relative to the nazir. He says the reason they're considered forbidden, even though the bones are not considered the meat, he says there's still inherent moisture inside of it, that no moisture gives us some sort of flavor. But he says this is only true to soft and moist bones. But he says if you have dry and hard bones, they don't give flavor at all. Therefore, according to all opinions, this would not be part of the count. So that is only true regarding the opinion that requires 60 times. But the opinion that requires 100 times, so even though the bones are still considered moist, nonetheless, the opinion that requires 100 times, it doesn't include the bones part of the count, because it doesn't assume that the bones are considered significant enough for that purpose. The second analysis he points out is that according to the opinion that requires 60 times, the kosher bones are included with the rest of the mixture to help achieve bitul of the tam isur. So meaning as follows, that according to the first opinion, it says 60 times. According to the heter side, we have both the meat and the bones that are being mevatel, the meat and the bones of the isur side. So it's not just the meat that is being used in order to diffuse the whole isur tam, the forbidden flavor, but also the bones. Even though the bones themselves don't have inherent flavor, they can be used as part of the count to actually kick off and remove the forbidden flavor as well. So even though they themselves are inherently, I guess, useless in giving tam, they can be used in order to prevent tam from being given off to other areas of the mixture. So being that we pass the halacha that we require 60 times, and this is something like most Jews should know, that you always require 60 times of heter to the isur. So halakha l'maaseh that we require 60 times more kosher to non-kosher. The Ran suggests that we should differentiate between soft and moist non-kosher bones, which give off forbidden flavor, and the hard, dry bones, which do not. So according to the Ran, if you have soft and moist bones, those would be considered asur, to be part of a mixture, because since they have inherent moisture, they're giving off some level of flavor that's being prevented. However, if it's going to be hard and dry bones, they are considered to have no flavor inside of them whatsoever, and therefore they are considered part of the heter side. So what is the source for the Ran? How does the Ran know that this is the case? Why does the Ran make this distinction? So he learns it from a Yerushalmi in Masechah Orlah in the first parak, Halacha Gimel, where it says the following. It says, when it comes to be mivatel truma, so when it comes to truma that's mixed with chulin food, and we said that the ratio needed is 100 to 1. The food waste of the truma, meaning any part of the truma that is itself inherently not edible. So the Gemara gives an example. If you have yeast in a barrel of truma wine, so to mean that the yeast itself is inherently not edible. So even though it's part of the truma as a whole, since it's not edible, they are not included within the volume of truma. So it's only things that are considered edible that would be considered part of the asur count, but anything that's not would not be. However, the food waste of chulin is combined with the remaining chulin to help nullify the truma that fell inside. So if you were to have a bunch of chulin wine with chulin yeast inside of it, and a little bit of truma wine and yeast also fell inside, and it became one mixture. So you have the wine of chulin and the wine of truma on one hand, and on the other hand, you have the yeast of chulin, but you don't have the yeast of the truma. Because again, even though the yeast of truma is considered truma, since it's not edible, it's not going to be part of the count. But regarding the chulin, their yeast, even though it's not edible, would be considered part of the count, so it becomes somewhat of a leniency. And from here, what ends up happening is the Ran understands that the bones, as it were, would also be able to function as the same thing. That even though the bones themselves are not edible, you can use the bones to diffuse the rest of the isur flavor, even though themselves cannot be. But how does he know it's only the hard bones and not the soft bones also? So there's a second opinion that holds that the shells of truma combine with the chulin to help nullify the truma. That's only shells that are able to do so. Meaning that if it's something that's hard and something that itself would be able to not be penetrated into, or something that does not give off inherent flavor, those things can be used to give off and prevent any tam from diffusing. But if something soft, apparently something softer than a shell, which apparently would be referring to softer bones, that is not sufficient. And from here, there is a distinction that's being found between hard and soft bones, and therefore it can be used to nullify it. So how do we paskin? What's halacha l'maaseh? So we find the Shulchan Aruch says the following: Chatichad nevela sheyesh basar batzimot shenafla l'kterat heter. So let's say you have a piece of nevela meat. So nevela refers to things that are not kosher because it was not slaughtered properly, and a piece of nevela meat fell inside of a mixture of permitted meat and bones as well, and they became one big pile. So inside of this mixture you have permitted meat, kosher meat, and non-kosher meat, and you have kosher bones and non-kosher bones also. So Shulchan Aruch says the following: Mitzarfim im hayeter levatel hayisur. So the forbidden bones, they combine. The forbidden bones combine with the kosher bones and kosher meat in order to be mevatel, in order to nullify the taste of the non-kosher meat. And it says that, of course, the kosher bones would combine with the kosher meat to be mevatel the Isser flavor as well. But he says, and I underlined it on the slides, however, he says if there's bone marrow inside of the bones, inside of the usher bones, so therefore since there's moisture coming out of it inherently, therefore that would not be mitzaref with the heter, but rather it would combine with the isur because it inherently is asur as well, since it's giving off flavor. Says the Ramah the following: V'yesh machmirim shelo l'tzaref atzamah le'isur im hayetel v'atal. He says there are those who machmir that hold that the asur bones, they don't go to the other side. They don't go with the isur side, but they don't help the heter side either. So they're kind of neutral. So there's a question why that's the case. I mean, seemingly when it comes to kosher and not kosher, it can't be in the middle. Usually it's either kosher or not. So there's somewhat of a discussion of why that's the case. We're not getting into that right now. But if you look at the shach in the bottom paragraph here, so we have the atzamot ha'isur. So he says, "Ulefi aniyot de'atim b'shas v'yushalmi kedat ha'ra b'sefer bedek habayit v'aran." So he quotes the Ran that we said earlier in Paragid Nashed that atzamot ha'rachot mitztafim le'isur ne'amol shebahen. So he quotes the Ran who makes a distinction between soft bones and hard bones. So he makes an actual distinction. According to the Shulchan Aruch, however, he doesn't make a distinction. He only says if there's actual marrow that's present. But if it's not present, even if it's soft, it would still be considered part of the kosher count. But according to the Shach, he says no. Even if there's no marrow, but if it's soft inherently, we could assume there's some sort of flavor inside that would still be given off. So there is somewhat of a disagreement between the two of them. Now, again, La'alach Alma said this Sfard Minhag is to go according to the opinion of the Shulchan Aruch and not according to the opinion of the Shach in this matter. So, continuing with this. The opinion of the Rambam. Now we have a very interesting opinion of the Rambam. Before we get to the Rambam, we have to understand something. According to the Shulchan Aruch essentially said that if you have non-kosher bones, it doesn't make a difference whether they're soft or hard, right? They can be combined with the kosher food to dispel the flavor of the asur meat. So according to this, is non-kosher bones kosher? If they can be combined with kosher food, what impression do I get from that? That it's kosher, right? Because if it's not kosher, how can you combine it with the kosher food? Right, that's an oxymoron. Doesn't make any sense. That would be impossible. So that's what it seems that the Shulchan Aruch is saying. However, you have a Rambam that seems to dispel this whole notion completely. The Rambam writes in Halachot Machlot Surot, Perek Daled, Halacha Yudchet, the following. He says, "Halcha min nivela terfa." If a person eats a nivela terfa, again, nivela means an animal that was not shechted, or terfa something that had a mortal wound. Those things are both not kosher. Or if a person ate from non-kosher animals, min ha'or or min ha'atzamot, whether from the skin, the hide of it, or whether from the bones, min ha'gidim or min ha'karnayim, whether it's from the tendons or from the horns, min tlefim, min ha'tzaparnayim, or from the hooves or from the nails of a sheshel off, from fowl. Afal pishu asur hareze patur she'elu enan ru'ei lachila. He says even though they're asur to be eaten, nonetheless, a person is pater, meaning he's pater from lashes and any other corporal punishment that comes along with it. So the Rambam says something very interesting, that bones, and when he says bones, seemingly he's not making a distinction over here, and we're going to get into that. He says bones from non-kosher animals. Doesn't make a difference what type of non-kosher it is. All category of non-kosher food. The bones that are associated with them are usher to be consumed, however you don't get lashes from them. Now, the question is, does this go against what we just read in the Shulchan Aruch? Because the Shulchan Aruch essentially said that the bones of non-kosher animals, seemingly not distinguishing between hard and soft, can be combined with kosher food. Now that again implies that those things are kosher, but the Rambam says they're not kosher. You don't get lashes for them, but they're still not kosher. So is that a machloket between the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch? Is that a machloket? And we have to get into this, or they're referring to two different cases. How do you go about that? And this, of course, is going to be somewhat of a controversy, and there's going to be somewhat of a discussion that needs to be addressed in order to understand that point. We can also say, from the second bullet point in the bottom, perhaps the Rambam is postulating the Pshat, the Gemara, and Chulin, which understands that the Isur bones do not combine with the Heter nor the Isur. Because if we saw the opinion that required 100 to 1, remember we spoke about the opinions of 60 to 1, 100 to 1. The one that required 100 to 1 said that you have the kosher meat against the non-kosher meat. We don't add bones to the equation at all. So according to that understanding, what ends up happening is that the non-kosher bones, they don't have any effect whatsoever. Meaning they don't give off time, but they're not permitted on its own right. So you could say, well, we don't paskin according to the opinion of 100 to 1. We actually go to the opinion of 60 to 1, who thinks that it should be part of the count. Nonetheless, he's taking some of the middle path, and maybe because you're saying it's Isur D'Oraita, he might be more machmir to that extent. It's something to be dealt with. So, how do we address this problem? Before we address it, we have to understand the relevance to gelatin, why all this makes a difference. So, a little background: gelatin is a flavorless ingredient that is derived from a protein known as collagen. What is collagen? Basically part of connective tissue that combines different cells together. Okay. It is obtained by boiling skin, tendons, ligaments, or bones with water, and is usually obtained from two animals, cows or pigs. Vast majority of them. Now, where is gelatin used in? It's used in cosmetics. Number 2, as a thickener for fruit gelatins and puddings, such as Jello. Number 3, in candies, marshmallows, cakes, ice cream, and yogurts. Number 4, in vitamins. This is a big one. Vitamins and different medications. They use them as a coating for capsules as well. And number 5, the last one, sometimes it's used to assist in clearing wines. Clearing wines as well. So, the question is, being that gelatin is derived primarily from things that is, according to the Shulchan Aruch, it seems there's somewhat of permissibility, and according to the Rambam, it's completely asur, even though there is no corporal punishment that goes along with it. Is gelatin permitted or not? How do we go about that? So there's a famous tshuva from the Achiezer that deals with this. So, the tshuva is in Siman Gimel Siv Bet. And we're going to read this together. Guys, are you able to see from the screen? Okay, we're going to read this together, and we're going to go by point. So he gets a shelah. B'dvar shelat, Iver efshar lachshir min avak chadash. He says regarding a question whether it is permissible to permit this new type of powder that came about, asher motzo b'atzamot yevashot, which is derived and found from dried bones, asher maravim oto beharbe minei ma'achal. He says in which it's mixed with many other different types of food. Gam amadim al yado minim shonim, and also the other types of things are placed inside as well. And it was explained exactly how it's made. In which you take dried bones, and they place inside of it, soaking inside of a solution of salt. So he says they place it in some sort of a solution as well with water and other chemicals. Or so in phosphorus. Then they cook them, they clean them, and they dry them. Then afterwards you have these bones that are going to be laid in order to dry for another 48 hours. And then they grind it to the extent it becomes literally like sugar and flour. And he says that it was explained precisely how the process is made. Now he's going to question whether this is permitted or not. So at this point, what we actually get from here is that since it's dried and since it's grounded, the impression that we give over here is that there is no flavor that's being given off over here. And we all understood already based on the introduction that the Torah only forbade things that give off flavor. Now granted, the companies that produce, at least originally, that produced the gelatin or the bones in which it's derived from came from non-kosher sources. What would be some of those non-kosher sources? So clearly they're, in the majority of cases, not going to be using kosher animals. They're not going to be using the bones and the hide of kosher animals, but they're using things that are nivelah, terfa, from different non-kosher animals that are inherently non-kosher, and so on and so forth. So therefore the question is, since these things are dry to a point which is no taste is being given, and it's completely far off from what it originally was, is it permitted to have them? So from the Shulchan Aruch, again, based on what we saw, it seems that some level of permissibility is permitted, whereas according to the Rambam, it seems that there is an Isur D'Oraita. So how does he go about it? So he says, he says, you can be matir in this. This thing should be permitted. It should be permitted. Why should it be permitted? So he quotes a Ramah. So he says regarding the keva. So the keva is referring to one of the stomachs of a cow, in which it was used in order to curdle cheese as well. He says sometimes they'd use the stomach, and what they do to it, they would dry it, they would salt it to the point in which flavor is no longer given. It becomes like wood. There's no flavor essentially. He says afterwards it's filled with milk, and the curdling process is allowed to happen. And there's no moisture of meat whatsoever. And over there it's permitted. Because since no flavor is being given, and it's completely dry, we're not concerned about basar v'chalav. Right? Even though it's going to be mixed with it inside of it, we're not concerned that anything comes out, and therefore the milk that comes out from there and all the cheese that's produced will be considered kosher as well. So what do we have in this situation? We have a potential isur. However, because it's dried, therefore the isur never comes into actuality, and therefore it is permitted. So he's going to use this logic to promote this idea as well. Meaning that if you're going to have something that's a potential isur, meaning the bones of non-kosher animals, however, something was done in order to prevent it from actually the isur being given off, therefore the isur should not exist. So he's going to use this as a theory to back this claim up. He said, and the Shach explains over there that this would apply to other isurim as well, that even tolaim, right, and blood as well, that even insects, which we know comes in the minimum of like 3 or 4 isurim. So now, if that's the case, if we find other areas in Torah in which things that are inherently asur wants to become dry as wood, that they no longer considered significant enough, therefore perhaps the same thing should be true over here. The same thing should be true regarding bones in which they're not asur min Torah, like you find with nevelat terfa, where it's only the meat that is forbidden, but the bones apparently would have a different status. As the Rambam explains in Halchot Malchot Asurot, so he quotes other sources as well. Now we're going to get into the crux of the issue. So this paragraph over here is the continuation of that same tshuva. He says it seems very clear that regarding dry bones there should not be any concern whatsoever. Because we already saw the halacha in Shulchan Aruch that says what? That the bones of non-kosher animals apparently could be combined with kosher food to be mevatel the isur tam, the forbidden flavors. And if that's the case, it should be considered kosher. It should be considered kosher according to that. And even according to the Shach, who says that we do distinct between soft and dry bones, even though the Shulchan Aruch did not, the Shach did assume that there's a distinction between soft and hard bones. The poskim explained that only when they are soft is it a problem, but if you take a soft bone and then you do something to dry it, therefore it's no longer considered a soft bone, it's considered a dry bone. And dry bones have like the status of etz ba'alma, like wood, and therefore it should not be an issue. Now he has to deal with the Rambam, because didn't the Rambam tell us that bones are forbidden no matter where they come from? The Rambam told us that. Even if it's dry, even if it's soft, all those things. Now, he's going to come with a very interesting way of reading the Rambam, which might be problematic. What does he say? The Rambam told us that bones are forbidden pretty much seemingly in all situations. So how does he explain this Rambam? That which the Rambam says over there. That the hides and the bones and the tendons are all forbidden. Even though they're asur, it's really patur from lashes. The Rambam is only referring to soft bones. He's not referring to all bones, he's referring to only the soft bones. Now, if you're going to get the pshat reading the Rambam, does he make that distinction? No, he doesn't. The Rambam said bones, and bones seemingly means what? All bones, right? He thinks that that's not the case. He thinks that the Rambam is actually agrees with the Shach, with the Ran, and with all those other Rishonim that say that there should be a distinction. But the Rambam seemingly does not make a distinction. But nonetheless, the Achiezer is assuming that this thing should be made, and the Rambam should be read accordingly. Let's go back over here. He says, Aval batzavot kashim in the middle paragraph. The first order of the line is Bahem Moach. Aval batzavot kashim vayivashim b'vadai gam Yisrael leka. He says regarding the hard bones and the ones that are dried, for sure, b'vadai. Absolutely, there is no isur with them whatsoever. The canon of Mishnah, Perek Orba, Rotev says the same thing regarding the Mishnah and Masech Chulin. Perish Rashi, Sheish B'Moach, Ve'ena Mistarfim L'Kazai, L'Shem Shiro Nevilak. Okay, continuing. And essentially, he gives a stamp of approval for gelatin for this reason. And he assumes that even though, if you're going to assume that the Rambam does think that bone should be forbidden, once they go through a process of drying, it should be permitted. And this becomes the famous tshuva of the Eliezer, which permits gelatin. That is a famous tshuva. Now, is this tshuva accepted by everyone? Well, clearly not. One of the biggest issues with this tshuva is the fact that seemingly the Rambam is being misrepresented over here. Because the Rambam never makes a distinction. And the way you should learn a Rambam is when the Rambam says something, he usually means exactly what he's saying. That's the pshat of the things. And most Achronim are going to disagree with him on this point over here. So now, the dissenting opinion. This is an opinion of Harav Aaron Kala, Alav Shalom. Others agree with him as well. We're not going to go through all the Shuvot. This is also an opinion from Harav Moshe Feinstein and others as well.
Yeshua.
Yes.
Before you finish, just look at this text that I sent you on WhatsApp.
Okay. So now, Mishnah Rabbi Aaron, Siman Yud Zayin. You guys can see it? Mm-hmm. Okay. So he quotes this idea from the Eliezer earlier on, and now he's going to challenge this idea. V'lucharat moa. He says it seems very strange, peculiar. So he says, in the Amar Dema She'at Tzamot. He says regarding that which it says in the Shulchan Aruch, that forbidden bones can be combined with heter, with kosher food. Hu mishum dat samot mutrim legamre. Right? You cannot assume that that's the case. That means from here that bones are completely permitted. It doesn't mean that at all. That's not what it means. So if that's the case, how come the Shulchan Aruch doesn't say that? How come he doesn't say that? He seemingly gives the impression that it's kosher. So is he disagreeing with the Rambam? When we mentioned this earlier on, when we saw the original Rambam, it seemed as if there was a contradiction. And really, all the poskim do not mention the Rambam at all. In which it's explicitly mentioned in which the bones are forbidden. How could that be the case? Especially regarding the fact that there are many Rishonim who actually believe that forbidden bones from non-kosher animals, actually combine with asur food as well. How is it possible that the Shulchan Aruch paskins seemingly opposite from what the Rambam says? He says, it seems the following, that really what's going on is that the bones are inherently forbidden if they're going to be consumed. Meaning if a person wants to consume a non-kosher bone as it is, therefore everybody would agree that it is forbidden to consume. It's not kosher. It is not kosher whatsoever because of a principle that is known as achshaveh. Something called achshaveh. Now what does achshaveh mean? Achshaveh comes from the sharash of something that's chashuv, something that's important. And this principle is found in Gemara Masechet Shvuot. We're going to go back to the tshuva, by the way. Gemara tells us the following: if you have something, non-kosher food, that completely lost its status of flavor, it's no longer edible whatsoever. But nonetheless, a person takes this non-kosher food that's no longer edible and he eats it in a normal fashion. The Gemara tells us that it's an Isur D'Rabbanan to do so. It's not Isur D'Oraita, but it's Isur D'Rabbanan to do so. Even though it's Pasul Ma'achila, even though it's no longer considered edible, the fact that a person makes it important from there, Achshaveh, Chashuv, he makes it important and recognizable as a bona fide food, therefore it's still considered food to you, and therefore the food status reawakened, as it were. So now we find this aspect also in Halachot Pesach, the Gemara Pesachim, brought down by the Rosh, also Paskin by the Mishnah Berurah, says the same thing as well. If you have chametz that became complete pasul achila, even to the extent which even a dog will not eat it, right? The famous idea that if a dog's not going to eat it, it's not considered chametz whatsoever. So even if the dog's not going to eat it, but a person takes this pasul chametz and eats it himself, so over here he did an isur. Why? Because even though the food is not considered chametz, from the right perspective, midirabanan, it's also to do so because you consider it to be bona fide food. It is considered food to your eyes, and therefore you're not allowed to do so. So now, going back to this idea over here, the dissenting opinion. So he says that even though bones are not considered to be food per se, nonetheless, if a person is going to be eating the food, as it were, just eating the bone itself, then you're going to be violating, apparently, at least in the Isur D'Rabbanan of Achshaveh. Right? And of Achshaveh, meaning that it's going to be reawakened. Now, according to this opinion, what ends up happening is when the Rambam says it's forbidden, but you're patur from lashes, what that actually means is the reason you're patur from lashes is because it's not an isur d'oraita, it's an isur d'rabanan. That's what it ends up being, because of the principle of achshave. So, continue with this. If you see on the 2, 4, 6, 7th line, where it says, V'nira d'savar le'davka be'inam asurim mishum d'achshavin. Because it's considered important and therefore it's a isur d'rabanan. He says because the whole reason that the bones were able to be combined with the kosher food was only because they were not edible as it were. Therefore no one considered them to be eaten. And therefore, as a consequence of that, even any moisture that was found inside of it would not be considered significant, and therefore it would not be forbidden. In our case, Shemarvin et gelatin bekavana, when a person is dafka mixing the gelatin, meaning that if my intention is to place the gelatin, which is composed of non-kosher bones and all the elements inside of a mixture, then what ends up happening is I'm giving value to the gelatin. Even though inherently it is not forbidden, but once I give being to it, I give it an establishment that it's important, therefore the principle of achshave comes along, and therefore even though it's not isur d'oraita, it's an isur d'rabanan. And from here, that's how we are supposed to understand Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam. There's no steer between the two of them. They're not contradicting one another, but they're talking about two different cases. The Shulchan Aruch is referring to a case in which the mixture happened on its own, and therefore there's nothing to be done, and therefore you could use it to be mitzdaref with the heter to be mevatel the isur tam. That's how you're supposed to understand it. However, according to the Rambam is talking about when a person dafka is eating it as it were. And over there, the Rambam says that it's not considered isur d'oraita, you don't get lashes for it. However, it's patur because it is asur. It's asur mid'rabanan. And that's how Harav Kotler understands it. And that seems to be, again, the pshat of the Rambam, because the Rambam doesn't make a distinction between hard bones and soft bones, as we saw from the Achiyesa. And you can ask anybody to read the Rambam and nobody would get that impression. It's very nice, you're trying to fit the Shachs and the Ran's theory into the Rambam, but it doesn't seem to go so well, especially when you're dealing with the stira. And a famous principle, if you're able to be mitaretz, to be I guess machriya, the opinions of the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam to fit together very well in a way that could fit all the answers perfectly, try to do that as opposed to assuming there's two different answers and ways to go about that. Now, if you look at the third bullet point, there is one interesting aspect of achshave that comes along. The question is as follows. Does achshave apply only if you're eating the bone as it were, or does it also apply if it's eaten with a mixture? So meaning everyone agrees that if you're going to be taking the non-kosher bone and eating it as it were, you're violating achshave on a d'rabanan level. But what if you take the bone and you crush it and mix it with everything else? Is that considered to be achshave? Meaning, does achshave apply only if the substance is consumed as it were, or even if it's mixed within a mixture? So now, we have interesting machloket to this. So we have a number of opinions. Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, Rav Chaim Ozer, which we saw from the Achiezer, and Rav Ovadia Yosef himself as well. So they reject that achshave applies even in the mixtures. Because according to what we saw from Rav Kotler, he assumes that since gelatin is mixed inside, achshave still applies. But they assume no. He says you can't bring that as a proof because achshave is only true if it's eaten as it were. But if it's mixed inside of another mixture, then achshave does not apply. And what is the case that they bring in order to prove this point? So there's a famous idea that's brought down by Rishonim, it's also passed in the Shulchan Aruch, that says many times when they take honey from the honeycomb, many times what would happen would be is that there's going to be bee legs inside of the honey itself. So now the bee legs, presumably being that they're composed of, I guess, bones to some degree that they don't have considered to be any substance. And the halacha is that they can be consumed with the honey itself if they cannot be separated because of the difficulty of the matter. So now, many want to say from here that achshave does not apply. Why? Because you have something forbidden apparently, and it's mixed inside of the honey, and therefore apparently achshave does not apply in mixtures. So therefore the gelatin should be permitted if it's in part of a mixture. But the other hand says, no, that's not a good proof. Why is that not a good proof? Because in the case of the honey, I didn't put the bee's legs inside of there. It was there. I didn't dafka put it, I didn't want it inside. But in the case of the gelatin, what are you actually doing? Putting it inside. And since you're putting it inside, the principle of achshave reawakens. So you cannot put it to the side so easily. And that's how it's understood. So the opinion that achshave doesn't apply to tarobit, you're right, maybe if it happened on its own, but if it happened dafka to be placed inside, it doesn't seem to hold a lot of weight because again, the importance is being reestablished. This is considered a primary ingredient. it doesn't make sense to say that. So how about actually for medicinal purposes? How about if they place, as we spoke about earlier, the gelatin placed in capsules and tablets, things of the sort. So when they're placed inside of there and you're going to be consumed, we assume that it has meaning. So in the related Shul, Rav Moshe Feinstein says the following: he held that even according to those who held the principle of achshave for mixtures, nonetheless it would be permitted to consume pills that contain the trait-derived gelatin, since it does not be consumed b'derech achila. Meaning, if they're non-chewable tablets, a person just swallows them as it were. We do not hold the principle, the Rabbanan principle of achshave, because it's not going to be consumed in a general manner. And again, this is only true if the tablets are not chewable. However, chewable tablets would not fall under this leniency because they're being chewed and therefore it's considered derech achilah, and they would only be permitted in life-threatening situations when there is no other choice and other viable options that have a kosher alternative. But if a person is basically a cholesh she'ein bo sakana, it's not a life-threatening situation, a person would not be able to rely on that, again, unless there is no other alternative. Now, this is only true regarding medication. Regarding vitamins, so Rabbi Yisrael held that this leniency does not apply to vitamins because since they're consumed not for, I guess, what we call the medicinal purpose, but rather nutritional function, therefore he does assume that actually does apply to vitamins but not to medication. So he would hold that gelatin would not be allowed in vitamins for that reason because they become more substantial. That's how we held. Now, in additional contemporation, why it becomes more problematic is for the following reason. So we said earlier on that the source of the gelatin comes from two main types of animals, from cows and from pigs. And that was true many years until the past 20 years ago. It ended up being that 90% of manufactured gelatin come from pigs. Okay, now that changes the ball game completely. Why does it change it? Because there's a Rambam. The Rambam tells us the following. We saw the early Rambam that said that when it comes to bones, and if they're being consumed deliberately, what happens is that he's violating an Isur D'Rabbanan. But there is a point of departure in which the Rambam says that there are exceptions to this rule. And the Rambam says, Yesh orot shen kibasar va'ochel mehen kezayit ka'ochel min habasar. There are certain animals in which their skin, and when he says skins, he's referring to other things besides the skin, meaning their bones and the hide and the hooves and things of the sort, that those things are not just considered like bones, but they're considered like the flesh as well. And those things, you're going to be violating the Isur D'Oraita for those. One of the examples, the elu she'oroten kibasar. These are the animals in which their flesh is considered like meat. Or ha'adam ve'or ha'chazir shel yishuv. And he says the flesh of man, and then he talks about domesticated pigs. Domesticated pigs. And from here, what ends up happening is, according to the Rambam, even if you want to bring this whole idea of achshave, but once you're dealing with domesticated pigs, which comes to exclude, I guess, wild boars, therefore you're going to be violating Isur D'Oraita. And since the majority of gelatin ends up coming from domesticated pigs, what happens? You're violating Isur D'Oraita. Even the idea of achshave doesn't even apply. So what was a leniency at one time is no longer going to be able to be considered leniency because the reality has changed. Other potential problems. So even if the bone from the dried non-kosher animal is halachically kosher, whatever way you want to argue, if you want to go to the Pirah of Chaim, also even if you're going to assume that that's the case, once it is cooked with any potential bone marrow inside, even the Shulchan Aruch would concede it becomes non-kosher as well. Because we saw the Shulchan Aruch that says that it's only the bones that can be combined with the heter. But regarding the bone marrow, they are asur midoraita because of the lachuchit and the isur tam that's inside of them. So now, the bones would only be permitted if it was completely dried. But if it's not completely dried and there's some bone marrow inside of it, once you start the cooking process, it starts cooking together and then the flavor is going to be given to the bones. And therefore, you already make the bones asur midoraita as well. Second point, perhaps the collagen from which the gelatin is derived has the same status as forbidden marrow. What exactly is collagen? I mean, it's a connective tissue, but how do we make the distinction between what's considered liquidy enough and considered solid? Because it's a very vague line between the two of them. We would say moach generally refers to the marrow, but there's so many things going inside of it, and it might be only dafka the bone and not anything else connective tissue that may be inside. So it's not exactly clear. And if it's true that collagen would be considered part of the issur of the moach of a bone, therefore you'd be dealing with Isur D'Oraita on every single case, and not just regarding the pig. So in conclusion, we have the following. Based on all considerations, be stated as follows. 5 main points. Number 1, leniencies that have existed in the past for gelatin become pretty much obsolete in our current times. Number 2, The original leniencies themselves were subject to much disagreement, and other potential issues could have arisen. Meaning, even during those days in which there were leniencies, there are many potential problems that come from the background that could completely have thrown it off, even if you do assume a leniency exists. Number 3, gelatin from non-kosher products are therefore in almost all cases are in the category of an at least Isur D'Rabbanan, if not Isur D'Oraita, because you're dealing with pigs and other potential issues that we spoke about. Number 4, kosher substitutes, which include kosher fish, kosher meat, or vegetable derivatives, must be used. Following, number 5, certain medical exceptions are permitted, such as when it is non-chewable tablets, when no other alternative is found. Thank you for your attention. Chodesh Tov.